Thank you all. Thank you all for joining Religion Dispatches today for our inaugural webinar, RD's First, titled simply Rage. Today, we will explore rage and its potential for transformative racial justice, the contemporary and historical weaponization of white rage, and the deployment of civility in maintaining social order. Who benefits from the boundaries of civil political discourse? And how can we channel our collective anger to move beyond it and toward liberation? For those of you who are new to Religion Dispatches or to its publishing home, Political Research Associates, Religion Dispatches is a daily outlet that is creating a new way of thinking about religion in American culture and politics, one that is both secular and independent and which invites free discussion of religious ideas once they've hit the public square. Political Research Associates is a social justice research and strategy center and publisher of Religion Dispatches. We are dedicated to blocking the advance of oppressive anti-democratic movements and to building a just and inclusive democratic society. Over the past 4 decades, PRA has researched, monitored, and publicized the agenda and strategies of the US and global right, revealing the powerful intersections of Christian nationalism, white nationalism, and patriarchy. After today's webinar, we definitely invite you to head over to religiondispatches.org and politicalresearch.org for more great reads and for more on our mission and vision for our shared world. So, helping us think through some radical potentials for improving said world, we are delighted to be joined today by 3 incredible thinkers wrestling with the question of the role that emotions play in the public sphere. We are grateful to be joined by Maisha Cherry, Assistant Professor of Philosophy at the University of California, Riverside, and the Director of the Emotion and Society Lab. Today's webinar was inspired by her latest book, The Case for Rage: Why Anger is Essential to Anti-Racist Struggle. Maisha is joined by Davin Phoenix, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of California at Irvine, and whose book, The Anger Gap, looks at how race shapes emotions in politics. And last, but certainly not least, Alex Zamelin, Professor of Africana Studies and Political Science at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. Alex is the author of 6 books, including Against Civility, The Hidden Racism in Our Obsession with Civility. Thank you very much to our esteemed panelists and to you, our wonderful audience, for joining us today. Please note the webinar will be recorded and the recording along with the transcript will be distributed by email and on RD and PRA's website in the next few days. Audience, we encourage you to introduce yourself in the chat so we can see who all is with us. And we encourage you to use the chat to engage in the conversation. You are also able to toggle on captioning, closed captioning on the bottom of the screen. And if you have any issues with that, feel free to message via the chat function our tech support. Okay, housekeeping notes are out of the way, so we can go ahead and get started. As we embark on our discussion, I'm going to start us with the visceral before we move into the abstract. What is one of the many absurdities of our political system or manifestation of socio-political violence in the contemporary US that fills you with simmering or acute rage? It can be anything from a relatively minor instance of hypocrisy to a full anti-democratic movement or trend. And if rage isn't your natural response to US politics and social order, which is okay in today's conversation, what frustrates or preoccupies you as you move around the world? So who on our panel would like to start?
I can get us kicked off. I just want to thank you for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. As I was thinking about this question, it really gets me going. We see just kind of endless examples of people finding themselves at the mercy of the phalanx of political and corporate elites who just don't fulfill their basic responsibilities and then find ways to elide all accountability and leaving folks just kind of in the shadows looking to pick up the pieces. Whether thinking about the residents of Ohio who are being poisoned, their families being poisoned, their pets dying, as just as the train derailment and the toxicity being produced. So we look at that as a result of the years of deregulation, and then we look at the train company that can't even show up for the town hall meeting, right? Leaving these people in the lurch. I think about the people in Texas who, as we're dealing with climate change and the weather's dipped below normal, they're left without power, right? And there seems to be no answers from people in charge of infrastructure and from, a governing body that's more concerned with busing migrants across the country for political capital than they are to address the basic needs of their residents. I'm thinking about this morning, I saw in LA, someone died by just being caught up in the wrong place at the wrong time in a police pursuit of suspects, and just thinking about the ways in which police violence is enacted in so many ways, but folks out here just trying to be John Wayne, folks caught in the crosshair. So I, think about all those linkages. Think about and I'll stop here. I think about the Black families in Florida who are told that like the most perfunctory explorations of their history and their contributions is now banned, right? Because maybe it makes some other kids uncomfortable. And so I just think about all the ways in which these folks, through no fault of their own, are just left out in the dust because, elites are just failing to meet the basic threshold and not seeming to be held accountable for it.
Thank you, Devin. I think that's a perfect start to today's conversation. Sort of the really acute contemporary in this moment examples and things that have been sitting with us now for a while. Alex, Maisha.
I'm no good. Are you gonna do it? Like, okay. I was just, Devin, just made me think about kind of a frustration that has been on my mind. I've just had a hard time trying to articulate what exactly it is. Of course, it's directed towards our politicians. And in some way, I believe I'm angry, frustrated, enraged about the fact that there are no intellectual, political, and spiritual adults in the room. I think there are a lot of problems that we face, and I think these are problems that happens anytime you get people in a community to live among each other. But we, at least in our democratic process, we believe in this kind of notion that if we elect certain kinds of individuals, they can represent us, they can come together, make decisions. Of course, that's a perfect kind of picture of what democracy looks like. But you do expect that there would be some results from kind of democratic liberation, hearing what the people have to say. And I think my frustration, as I look at the news and I look at how politicians are more interested in being popular around very narrow bases, provocative for no reason, and have political ambitions that have nothing to do with the people. And as a result, there are lives that are tremendously being affected by these decisions. And I think I'm kind of heartbroken by that. And as much as we'll talk about civility in a little bit, but as much as we might think that this is a failure of political representation, I'm nervous about I guess you could say, the impact that this is really having beyond the rhetoric, beyond the headlines, the impact that it's having on actual lives, that our political leaders are not doing their democratic, sympathetic, intellectual, spiritual jobs. And it's affecting lives in tremendous ways.
Thank you, Maisha. I was, reflecting on your comments, thinking about sort of the immaturity of our political system, but then thinking about how there are literal children doing more for climate justice, for gun violence, than, the adults, the so-called adults in the room. I appreciate you really talking about the political system and its many failures. Alex.
Thank you so much for inviting me to the panel. I'm so excited to be here with such great guests. And, I think to kind of follow off what folks have been saying, as someone who kind of looks at history and examines history, I think the thing that kind of enrages me and bothers me the most is this kind of repetition of the past without any clear future vision. And I think that everything we see today, whether it's police brutality, whether it is incarceration, whether it is violence on the streets, whether it's apathy, all the things that we just named, these are all things that have existed in the past in various contexts. And these are all things that activists, those concerned with social justice, have pointed to. One of the things that I show my students is that the I Have a Dream speech specifically names police brutality as a crisis in American society. Now, we don't remember that. It's much easier to whitewash it, to forget it. But King names that. This is a crisis that King was dealing with in 1963. And the fact that we continue to have these conversations over and over, and endless amounts of ink are spilled on how do we reform policing? How do we deal with all of these problems that have plagued us over the years? What's striking to me is that these problems are kind of repetitions of a haunted past, and there are brilliant activists who have provided solutions. So King's solution is, a social democratic society. King's solution is to deal with the structural conditions rather than simply talking about reforming a few bad apples, And so the cycles of surprise, of kind of hand-wringing, of shrugging one's shoulder, as if this is the first time we've encountered these problems before and these dynamics. I think that is something that really, really bothers me and, upsets me.
Thank you, Alex. Yeah, the Sisyphean nature, I think, of the task at hand can be incredibly, incredibly enraging. I think we start in a good place with tangible examples, with tangible emotions in hand. And I'd like for us to move through a discussion where we see what we can do with these feelings and these emotions and this orientation of outrage. So I'd like to move to a discussion of what we mean when we say rage or anger. Let's start with, what is rage? Maisha, how is rage in its less acute form, anger, distinct from emotions like despair, dismay, concern? What are the unique qualities of anger that give it political salience?
Yeah, so I'm gonna try not to make this my emotion seminar. If we can categorize anger as an emotion, we know that it's kind of a response to wrongdoing. We call it a blameworthy emotion. That usually responds to something that we find offense to, something that we judge to be bad, which is very different from, for example, a disappointment, right? So disappointment may arise when outcomes didn't go your way, but not necessarily a moral outcome, right? Sadness may arise, kind of something similar, but it has nothing really to do with wrongdoing. So it responds particularly to wrongdoing. It points out that a wrongdoing has occurred, and particularly usually has a target and just singles out or is directed to the person who indeed did the wrongdoing. One of the things that I kind of say in my work, and one of the things that we know about emotions is that not only does it has this particular profile, but it has kind of what we call kind of an approach tendency. So usually what emotions do, they motivate you towards a particular action, or at least they can have the tendency to motivate you towards a particular action. So sadness may lead you to retreat. Fear may lead you to retreat or to go forward. But one of the unique things about anger that it leads you to approach the target or the cause of your anger. And so one of the things that I kind of signal out in my work, and one of the reasons why I think that we need to kind of keep anger in our moral and our political toolkit, is that it can be good motivation to do something to end the cause of the anger, right? So it can motivate us to kind of end injustice. Another thing that I kind of, particularly kind of anger that I motivate in my book, is a kind of anger that is inclusive. So it's usually kind of have a perspective to it. You think about, yes, I am angry that a wrongdoing has occurred, but I'm not just angry that it's occurred for me, but I'm afraid about what it would do to others. And so I'm not only thinking about myself, but I'm thinking about its implications for the particular community. And so because I believe that anger can have these positive features, now no doubt we can talk about this in a little bit, that it can go wrong, as any emotion can go wrong. But I think particularly the kind of context that we were just describing, I think anger that arises in this particular context has a lot of potential. And that's why I think it's important to kind of keep it and not get rid of it just so much, but to continue to kind of moderate it, to make sure that it's maintaining its virtuous features so that we can use it for good. One of the things I'm going to say this, one of the things that people have a tendency to say is that, why can't we just get rid of anger? Well, if we get rid of all wrongdoing, then yeah, anger will be completely irrelevant. But as long as there is wrongdoing in the world, as we just described, then anger will always have a place. And I think the challenge for us is to make sure that our anger is directed towards the right thing, as Aristotle would say, towards the right people, that we do something productive and bringing about the change that we want to bring. But there's no doubt that it can go wrong. And I think one of the things that I try to do in my book is to arm us with the resources to make sure that it continues to go in the right direction.
Thank you. That was a big question, and you did a wonderful job of really helping us understand what it is about rage that actually brought us into this room today. Why are we talking about one specific emotion? And I want to highlight sort of some of the themes: the community building aspect, the confrontational piece, right? We need confrontation for change, and the way in which rage is reactive, but in a way that's looking for accountability. And I really want us to stick with these themes. So thinking about how rage currently operates in US politics, we've talked about it in our personal sort of how we're oriented to today's moment. We've talked about it as an abstract emotion, its list of qualities. I'd like for us to discuss who gets to mobilize their movements, constituencies on the basis of anger today. And Davin, your book, The Anger Gap, deals directly with the real differences in the perception and deployment of white and Black anger. Maisha, you write about the anger police. Who are the anger police and to what end are they policing? And Alex, in Against Civility, you detail how the very concept is designed to strategically bound the limits of acceptable political discourse, suppressing authentic felt responses to injustice. I want to start here with civility. Alex, what do you mean by civility? In what context, and how does it relate to the prevailing social order?
I was thinking of Maisha's comment, and I think that, one of the things that I am trying to do is identify civility less as a moral virtue and more as a kind of political response, a program, an agenda. And so despite the fact that I kind of understand the particular values and virtues that might come from a person being compassionate, seeking compromise on an interpersonal level, I think it's so crucial for us to think about political mobilization of these concepts and ideas. So when I think of civility, I'm not thinking about people kind of breaking bread at the dinner table or talking about kind of, the prospect of reconciliation. I'm talking about this language being mobilized in politics for the sake of either policing legitimate discourse, silencing protest and righteous anger, or creating the conditions that make it difficult for people to survive and thrive. And so what I try to do in the book is trace the way that almost every mobilization by elites, whether it's slaveholders like John C. Calhoun in the 1830s, when we first see this language emerging, whether it's white moderates in the 1960s that King is responding to, all of these deployments of civility are almost always, when it comes to racial justice, being used to diminish, to police, to silence the voice of those citizens who not only have the most to say in terms of critiquing the system of racial injustice, but historically are the most effective. It's abolitionists, it's Black feminists, it's civil rights activists, it's prison abolitionists. And so what I mean by civility is something like a discourse that imagines that the solution to political problems can simply be understood through a kind of moral us and them attitude, which then highlights ideas of compromise, of reconciliation in the political sphere. What I'm trying to say is that the most effective way to achieve political change is actually not through civility. It is precisely through civility that we have seen a policing of the boundaries of what counts as exemplary citizenship.
Thank you, Alex. That's an excellent place to jump off with Davin. you really talk about the way in which civility has been used to police and the us versus them quality of civility. So who are the us and them? Davin, who gets to be angry? What does the politics of white anger look like? And what is its political efficacy?
Yeah, so I really hope to build on the synergies across our work. In my work, I'm thinking about, race being a driving force in politics and observing the ways in which historically and contemporarily, Black people as individuals and as collectives don't have the same runway to express anger or even just kind of political dissatisfaction. If we look at a number of kind of, general and specific instances of the ways in which Black emotions are policed, whether it's literal hyper surveillance and over policing of Black communities, and of course, the efforts to tear down and destroy Black organizations, right? Black political movements that carry potential to be actually transformative. Whether we think about relatively recently, kind of after after Michael Brown's killing in Ferguson and that arrest, he had the FBI put out a report that was made public saying, in the spate of all these incidents of police violence against Black communities, we need to be on the lookout of BIEs, Black identity extremists, which doesn't refer to any actual standing collective or group. You look at that report and you can look at it, it's widely available. Well, not widely available, but people made it available. It's literally saying we presume that Black individuals are going to be angry about this. And so that demands monitoring, right? So we see they recognize the spate of state-sanctioned violence and are not problematizing that, but are problematizing the potential anger response of Black people to that violence. I think that's a really solid kind of contemporary example of the ways in which Black anger is even policed before it even kind of gets a chance to manifest itself. But we continue to see examples of that. In contrast, we see plenty of examples of white individuals and white collectives having full license to express their anger and that anger moving the needle. That classic idea in that movie Network, I'm mad as hell, I'm not going to take it anymore, right? This is a rallying cry that many non-white people can't imagine publicly proclaiming because of the pushback they get, whether it's in the form of kind of official type of policing or even kind of social stigma, right? And I thought Maisha will speak to this, the kind of angry Black woman trope, or even the kind of angry Black man as this boogeyman trope. When Michelle Obama left office, she had that interview with Oprah where she talked about how much it stung to be labeled an angry Black woman, despite her very vigilant attempts, right, to always come across as even keeled that continue to haunt her. And so we enjoy that contrast, right? Because if you're not able to show your anger, there is a real accountability gap, because we see within the political sphere, anger does move. It's a signal to political officials that they are in trouble if they do not respond to you. Because as Misha really rightly pointed out, anger moves people to action. It makes them more confident in their actions. It makes them less risk averse than they normally are. And it motivates them to kind of right that wrong that they perceive. And so when we look at how white anger plays a role in politics, we see endless examples of it. We see parents worked into a frenzy over the specter of CRT in schools. We see thought leaders really on both sides of the aisle, within the academy, within journalism, within popular media, railing against this imagined cancel culture, right? We see political figures who seem to be basing their entire campaigns not on real issues of governance and real challenges that we face, but on combating wokeness. During the pandemic, the height, we saw people engaging in anti-masking, anti-shutdown rallies. We see misinformation campaigns to disingenuously frame the fight for trans rights as a danger to our children. All of these are mobilized and stoked by people's sense of anger. And what's kind of the linkage, right? It's not just generally white people, but it's white people that are positioned to benefit the most from a status quo. And when they are looking at pushes for greater inclusion or greater equity or even greater recognition, their response is, I'm offended by that call to create more space for people that I do not deem worthy of that space. And I'm hostile to it. And I'm publicly and loudly aggrieved by it. We can draw a contrast not only in how frequently we see these movements animated by grievance, but the response to those movements, right? The response to all of those campaigns and movements and actions is, well, let's contrast that with a counter set of information. We don't see that effort. We see actual efforts to stifle expressions of Black anger and Black grievance. We saw a very vivid example in this kind of very, speaking of things that enrage me, we saw the countdown to the release of the video of the young man in Memphis being brutally attacked, right, by those police officers. And so as we were counting down to this latest spectacle of Black violence, what was the overwhelming call? A call for nonviolence for Black communities. And so what are we reckoning with? We're grappling with the specter or the fear or the potential of Black anger being more of a threat than that actual spectacle of violence that we see be kind of routinely inflicted upon Black communities. So that's a number of ways, right, in which we see kind of who gets to act on that anger and the ways in which they get to benefit from that, the ways in which even it gets to be legitimated, even if people disagree with that. They're not saying we can't have that, we don't do that. But when Black people want to, and I see broadly kind of non-white people and what's marginalized people generally, right? When they're ready to like make their grievance known, it's like, no, we can't have that. And then we see those bounds of civility that Alex is speaking to look to kind of squelch that.
Yeah, thank you, Davin. I think we see from your examples exactly who is beholden to standards of civility and who has free reign, right? And you queued up, Maisha, perfectly. We cannot talk about rage without talking about the specter of the angry Black woman and the use of this designation as one of the most powerful tools for silencing people who not only live at the intersection of multiple modes of oppression, but who consistently lead some of the most powerful movements for gender, sex, racial, and economic liberation. So who is the angry Black woman and who is so deeply invested in her silence?
Yeah, I like this question. I have so much to say, so let me kind of focus here. As I was listening to my co-panelists speak, one of the things that I kind of failed to articulate to kind of make sense of why there is kind of movements for civility, and I think stereotypes, which we're alluding to, is a way to police Black bodies, female bodies, et cetera, et cetera. And that key kind of undercurrent component, I mean, we mentioned kind of the motivational aspect of anger, right? So if you want to really stop people from being about change, and if anger is able to mobilize change, and of course you want to, tell them to be quiet, et cetera, et cetera. But that's not the only thing that you're trying to put a stop to or silence to, right? One of the things about anger is that as much as it calls out wrongdoing, it also ascribes value to the person who has been wronged. Right? It simply says that their life matters. I mean, Black Lives Matter, you don't even have to articulate that. The anger says it by itself, right? You would never get angry about something being harmed if you do not value it, right? So just the expression of anger, having anger in response to wrongdoing, you're not just responding to the wrongdoing, but you're also saying that the person who has been wronged is indeed valuable. So to combine that with what is happening when you're calling for civility, what is happening when you're utilizing stereotypes to silence people, you're trying to get them not to go about being a part of action-oriented works, but you're also trying to silence their claims to value, right? And of course, this is very, very, very important because the fight for any kind of change is not just rooted in kind of the material fight, but it's also a psychological fight, right? It's these underlying claims that kind of build in supremacist kind of societies, right? And I think that's very, very, very important. So I think the way that the stereotypes work is that they do work as a form of silencing not only the action, but the claims of particular individuals, right? And this is very, very important, particularly for those who have kind of these multi-layered kind of identities in which it's already the case that in a kind of white supremacist society, Black lives don't matter, right? Well, in a sexist society, female bodies don't matter, right? And so the power in some ways of the Black, the angry Black woman stereotype is that it is a way to silence kind of both of those claims to value, right? That not only don't your claims to value matter in the context of race, but it also doesn't matter in the context of gender. And so what it does is that the stereotypes allows you to self-police, right? Because you don't want your race to look bad. You don't want to confirm and make it bad for other Black women. And so what makes these stereotypes so powerful is that it gets the person to self-police themselves, right? So that they would not articulate the claims to value and so that they won't put this stuff in action. One of the things that I argue for in my books, and the question is, what do you do as these claims of civility are being echoed? What do you do given the presence of these particular stereotypes? And I suggest that we break these racial rules, right? And one of the racial rules is you don't have a right to white male anger. Well, I say forget that, right? proclaim your anger however way prudently you think that to be the case. But I think the way to fight back and push back against these calls of civility is to be angry, to be expressive with that particular anger. And I offer some strategies at the very end of my book of how to fight back against the anger police, right? Reminding people that your anger is valuable, that you're not crazy, that you're not imagining things, kind of fight back against these particular strategies, because these strategies are very, very, very powerful in ways that it doesn't take someone on a news panel to call your anger out, that you can begin to do that work yourself. And I want people to be aware that once you start doing it, to yourself, to recognize how powerful society has made it the case for you to do that, and be reminded that your anger matters, that it ascribes value to your life, to the lives of others, and to keep using that anger to motivate change, because that's exactly what they don't want you to do.
Thank you, Maisha. Perfectly put. That emphasis on value, I think, is really another aspect of rage that really demonstrates its political efficacy and its strength, right? And also your point about sort of internalized oppression and self-policing. I've been talking to some colleagues in sort of the post-colonial experience or the colonial experiences. You internalize colonialism, right? Like you start to impose supremacist values on oneself and one's own community. And so you really provide a way out of that trap. I'm going to continue our discussion with sort of where we see rage felt and acted upon and then suppressed. And Davin, in your book, you parse the ways in which anger, particularly anger felt and channeled by Black Americans, operates differently in different spheres of political expression. I found this really fascinating in your book. So namely looking at spheres of oppositional organizing, like protests and vote, and then in voting in formal elections. Can you detail this difference for us?
Sure, yeah. So to put it simply, I'm finding a couple of different ways in which anger is translating to kind of political engagement for Black and white folks. So generally, like I find anger, as expected by the kind of conventional wisdom that's not really paying attention to race, is for white Americans really broadly a mobilizing emotion, right? Whether it's kind of making actions to influence an election outcome, like volunteering and donating to campaigns, or contacting elected officials, attending town hall meetings, and then down the line to like protesting and boycotting. But among African Americans, anger generally has kind of a much clearer relationship to behavior, but where that anger is most pronounced, and I don't find this kind of surprising or not intuitive in any way, is in those counter-institutional or those kind of outsider actions. So I see Black people's expressions of anger over politics translate most clearly and most pronouncedly to protesting and boycotting and more kind of conflictual forms of action. And I think a big part of that is when I have a chance to get sets of white and Black folks to talk about, what makes them angry about politics. For white folks, it's like, very specific objects of their anger, this regime or this party or this policy, right? These figures or individuals. And for African Americans, it's such a different response. It's really generally just the system itself, right? They're not calling out a party or a figure or even a policy. They're talking about things that even blur the lines, right, between political and the quote unquote non-political, which makes the point clear that it's all political, right? They're angry about cultural appropriation, right? They're angry that Black people continue to have to work twice as hard to earn half as much, right? They're just angry about the whole general state of affairs. And so it makes sense that anger would translate to these kind of protest type actions, because if you're not directing anger towards any regime, then, these actions to change the regime just feels like, rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, right? If your anger is directed at the system, you want to push back against that system, and you can feel more licensed to translate that anger, because if you are working outside of the system, you do not need to be beholden to the rules of that system, the rules that we've been talking about. The rules penalize you or stigmatize you for that anger. So that's really important. I just want to echo another finding that I found that really dovetails so nicely with what Maisha has said. Black people's expressions of anger are also associated with a lot of indicators of both intra-group solidarity with other Black folks and inter-group solidarity with other groups of color. To kind of echo that point about anger, it's being a significant force in the move for racial justice. So I'm finding that when Black people are more angry about politics, they're like more supportive of the Black Lives Matter movement. They're even more opposed, because there are some Black folks that I'm finding are less opposed to racial profiling. They're more willing to work with Latinos, particularly in the Trump era, to oppose Trump. So we see that anger both having a particular impact on Black people's action, but also, helping to kind of facilitate the seeds of coalition building, both within the group and with other marginalized groups.
Thank you, Davin. Really excellent insights, especially sort of thinking about that coalitional piece you concluded with and going back to sort of rage as community building, right? I want to open this question also to you, Alex and Maisha. Are there sort of realms of politics, realms of discourse that you see, civility, rage, other competing emotional frameworks interacting differently with the context?
Yeah, I can jump in. I mean, I was thinking, one of the things that really struck me, and this is connected to a lot of the conversation we've been having, is if you have a kind of historical attitude, you see something really striking when kind of white citizens deploy rage. It's often reinterpreted as love for one's community. Whereas when citizens of color engage in those acts of rage, it's imagined to be criminal. So I think about, we're talking about Black feminism, and I think about one of the things that I think was so valuable about Ida Wells in the late 19th century was that she was, an important anti-lynching activist. And one of the things that she tried to do through her journalism was point out the ways in which specific instances of racial violence, whether it was, lynching against, Black citizens in the South, or white militias trying to overtake basically successful Black towns, the Wilmington massacre, for example. What was so striking was that many of these white citizens, in engaging in these activities, saw themselves as enacting love connected to rage. There are these really striking examples of senators. Ben Tillman, for example, gets in front of the Senate floor and proclaims that racial violence is justified because it's an act of love. And so I think that it's crucial to have a historical perspective on the ways in which we're talking about the inequality of kind of dispensing emotion in public for political gain, the ways in which even emotions like rage are imagined to have kind of different textures depending on the kinds of citizens who deploy them. And so, from the perspective of history, thinking about the way civility has been deployed, that's one notable kind of and clear thing, which is when Black citizens, when Black activists deploy civility, there's an attempt to criminalize, demonize police. When white activists engage in it, there's an attempt to understand, to empathize, to ask what the roots of that frustration might be. So it's not simply that forms of civility work to police expressions of indignation and anger. It's also that the kind of national discussion and the political conversation after these moments turns in radically different directions depending on the group.
That's fascinating. I'm thinking about kind of a famous line by Cornel West, where he says, I'm paraphrasing here, in a white supremacist world, Black love is a crime, right? And so it could be the case that your anger is interpreted as, oh, you love Black folks. But in a white supremacist society, loving Black folks is a crime, so you're still doing something wrong, right? I'm thinking about, I've talked about how anger makes claims about the world, right? So it exposes a wrongdoing, it says that the person is valuable. But one of the things that I think is important is that we learn a lot about what a person values when they're angry, but you also learn a lot about what people believe and what people value in their responses to anger. And as we're talking now, I'm thinking about in the transcripts with Darren Wilson, for example, when he's describing what happens as he shoots Michael Brown. He basically says and I'm paraphrasing here, he says, he was, looking up at me as if he was possessed with something. And then he says something along the lines of, as if he was angry that I was shooting at him. I want you to think about that for a moment, right? This unarmed Black man is being shot by the police, and the policeman can't understand his anger. And I think that's a perfect example of when you can no longer understand someone's anger, when you're torturing them, when you're killing them. It says a lot about your beliefs and about your values. And I think it shows a lot about how far we've come, how far we've got to go.
Thank you, Maisha. That's such a poignant example. I'm going to keep us moving in this conversation. I think we could spend a lot of time here. You all have really teased up the, I think one of you said the texture of anger, and that is what I really feel like we're getting at here. Before we come back to anger, and Maisha, your vision for Lordian anger, which I'm really excited for you to share with our audience today, I want to talk about, and spend time thinking about alternatives to silence, civility, and the monopoly of white rage. And one of our audience members just asked a question, I think, that really gets us moving in this conversation. Are there contexts in which civility for empathy's sake is good? So are there forms of civility potentially that are useful and have political efficacy and justice related to it? And so, Alex, you write about civic radicalism, and I really would love for you to talk through what civic radicalism is, what its relationship to civility is, and what its relationship to rage is.
Yeah, I think this is an important question. I try to be careful about the way I imagine civility in the political process, and I try to highlight the ways in which a politics based in civility is a politics that tries to moralize. It's a politics that tries to create easy oppositions. It's a politics that tries to silence righteous indignation, rage, protest, and all of the emotions that we've been talking about that historically have real positive value. And it's not just a philosophical argument, it's an empirical one. You can look at every single social movement, specifically every anti-racist movement, from the anti-slavery movement to the civil rights movement to the Black feminist movement to the prison abolition movement. And what you see over and over again is that they enact a politics that is based on what I call civic radicalism. And by civic radicalism, I mean a politics that focuses on engaging in disruptive activity that tries to make a claim about what matters, about whose lives are being denigrated and who is in a position of power and who is dominated. In other words, civic radicalism is a vision that is less about trying to create moments of compromise than it is linking instances of groups into coalition, uniting through acts of solidarity, naming the frustration that you see, being able to act against it. In other words, any anti-racist movement that you can point to throughout American history, I would argue, did not engage in a politics of civility. It engaged in a politics of civic radicalism. Even the classic example, the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King was accused of being angry, and it was partly a response to that anger and frustration and being deemed criminal that King penned a letter from a Birmingham jail. And one of the things that he says, which, I think, again, is so important to remember is, the greatest stumbling block is the white moderate, because the white moderate hides behind civility and hides behind this neutral playing field. Whereas the Klansman, at the very least, despite King's vociferous opposition to him, still makes a stand and is able to identify their commitment. So King himself in the civil rights movement, it's a nonviolent movement, but it's a movement of civic radicalism because it relies on a politics of disruption, direct action, engagement, and a desire to build coalition with the willing rather than necessarily reaching across the line to those who dehumanize you and oppose you.
So to summarize, I think what I'm hearing, so it's sort of the idea of disruption, but with positive political good as as the motivating, like that's the civic part of the radicalism, right? That this is a positive political project, and disruption is a necessary component. And I think that's an excellent orientation to the mobilization of rage that we see in anti-racist movements. Davin, you also look at other forms of mobilizing emotions in your work. You look at enthusiasm, hope, and pride, and the role that they play in the political mobilization and agency of Americans of color. Can you talk us through your argument here?
Sure. And I want to say at the outset, right, that this doesn't kind of shift the conversation away from anger, right? Because these need not be looked at as like the opposite end of the spectrum, right? People can feel these positive emotions at the same time that they feel the anger, because we're complex and layered and multifaceted. So I think that's a really important disclaimer for me to make. But, you know, a lot of the influential political psychology work I was drawing from kind of lumps together positive emotions under this umbrella of enthusiasm. And I wanted to unpack that a little bit and think, okay, these discrete emotions of like hope, right? Which is a sense of I have this kind of confidence that something that would benefit me or would benefit us is possible. It looms in the horizon. And then this discrete positive emotion of pride, which is a very distinct emotion. It's very self-reflective, right? Pride is like guilt and shame. It's a feedback mechanism that we receive based on what we do. And so when you're proud, you know, you individually or collective, right, did something that animates that sense of we got this, right? And so I found when Black people have a concrete sense of hope, like what I call a credible hope, right, they're more active in politics, right? They're more likely to vote. They're more likely to talk about this issue with others. They're more likely to kind of do the whole host of actions that might make that hope a reality. Now, when people are feeling proud, and then some follow-up work, I show that, you know, kind of specifically pride in Black people's achievements, or even pride in, you know, Black elected officials that they think are, you know, doing right by the group. That is a very strong mobilizer of a wide set of actions, from actions tied to election, to contacting officials, to even, you know, protesting and boycotting. That for, in my analyses, pride is kind of having this universal push towards action for African Americans that anger is for White Americans. I'm also finding that, you know, we kind of talked about when we're defining anger, you know, a big part of anger that distinguishes it from these other negative emotions, that you feel a great sense of agency, right? You not only feel that violation of that norm, but you feel confident that you can do something about it, right? If you don't feel confident, maybe you're more anxious or despairing, right? Frustrated. But anger is really tied to that sense of agency. But in my work, I'm finding that the traditional ways we view political agency, right? Like my input matters, you know, my voice actually affects change. That I find that actually being more tied to pride than to anger. So again, I don't want to posit that the key is like, oh, it's okay that they're not feeling licensed to express their anger because you're just getting somebody hopeful about. Like, we need all these emotions, right, in concert. But I do find that these positive emotions can be more, I think, effective at generating engagement, particularly for marginalized group members, than I think the conventional literature, you know, scholarship would have suggested.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. I really found your work on pride to be really interesting. And similar to what Maisha was starting us off with in today's conversation, right? Pride also is a value statement, right? You are proud of yourself because you believe you have value. And I think that doesn't, going to your point that these are not mutually exclusive ways to orient oneself. Knowing one's value and being mobilized by it seems to be really key here. All right, let us get into rage and Lordian rage. As I mentioned up top, Maisha, your book was the impetus for today's conversation. Religion Dispatches editor Evan Durkatz was really excited to engage with you on sort of the political potential of rage, and then it sort of blossomed into this amazing panel. So tell us, what is Lordian rage and what is its political possibility?
Yeah, so to even say that there's a kind of a distinct kind of anger suggests that there are other kinds that we're probably not talking about. And I think it's important to understand these other kinds, because one of the things that I think that I'm trying to do in my work is to kind of get us away from the idea that anger is one thing. And usually when we think that, we say anger bad, all anger types are bad. Probably not in the case of like Kavanaugh's and white men, but we think all encounters or all manifestations of anger is bad. And so I get people to kind of refrain from painting anger in broad strokes. And a lot of that depends on answering several questions. For example, what is the anger directed at? What is one aiming to do? What kind of perspective kind of influences that anger? And so answering those questions are very, very, very important. And so before I even talk about loading rage, I talk about a kind of rage that arises in the context of political injustice, something I call white rage, which is something that we saw at the Capitol. And I contrast even narcissistic rage that may seem kind of virtuous, but one only wants justice for oneself or one's class, right, as opposed to all folks. So there's a variety of kinds, and I wanna kind of lead us towards kind of living out a life in which, when we are angry, we have this more positive kind. So the Lordian Rage, named after the poet essayist Audre Lorde, and it was tremendously inspired by her popular essay, The Uses of Anger. She motivated the book, motivated me to get back into grad school, because I just wanted to really dive deep into what this emotion was that I just was feeling myself in response to racial injustice, and what I was seeing other people feel as well. And it's kind of inspired by her account of anger. And the way that I see it is, contrasted with white rage. One of the aims is change. I mean, she talks about kind of use anger as for a radical transformation of our world, which is quite different when you have kind of other types of anger. So in the case of white rage, one uses that anger, particularly because it's directed at racial others. One uses that anger to get rid of, to exclude, to bring about the societal death of other individuals. But with Lordian rage, I mean, if it's directed at race and racism, if it's aiming, for change, a radical transformation of our world, then when one actually engages in particular actions, one is less prone to storm into the Capitol and rather storm into a voting booth, for example. So it has kind of positive features, the kind of dimensions that I think that any and all of us would say is in line with kind of our democratic and liberal values. But just because it is, doesn't necessarily mean that we're more open to it. And so the challenge is not only to have this Lordian rage, but to kind of resist kind of this kind of archaic kind of notion, traditional notion that we have about just being scared of anger in general. And what I want to say is that if your anger is directed at race and racism, if who you're thinking about having a better life includes not just yourself, but all people. If you're aiming for change and not just like a cozy kind of change, but you're willing to engage in and accept kind of a radical world or kind of a radical transformation so that people get justice. If you're, you don't want justice just for yourself or for everyone else, and it's not a zero-sum game, then you have what I'm referring to as Lordian rage. And I want to encourage you to keep it, not allowing the anger police to get rid of it. I want to encourage you to continue to use it, to ascribe values to lives, to continue to allow it to motivate you to engage in action. And don't be ashamed of it, but walk around with it with pride. And that's kind of the spirit of the account.
Thank you. I found it a really inspiring concept and a really succinct and moving way to talk about productive, meaningful rage. You touched a little bit on this, sort of there are other forms of rage, and you talked about white rage. And I want to stay with this for a second. We're going to come back to our final discussion is going to be on like, how do we deploy Lordian rage, and what are your recommendations as our esteemed panelists for how to do this well, right? And how to do this in a really well thought out way. But before we do that, I want to make sure that we understand the terrain of rage, of anger, and the dangers it can pose. Are there moments, contexts, or movements? Are there individuals where politically valuable rage becomes destructive or impotent? Are there conditions under which it is not politically expeditious to forswear civility? Like, what is the strategy here? Are there limits to who can rage and under what conditions? And the answer could be no, or the answer could be yes, there are some helpful parameters. And I'd be really interested to get into the strategy question with all three of you. So whomever would like to start.
So I would just say there's a lot of ways in which you can go wrong as in with love, for example. But there's a lot of ways that it can go right? And I think I really believe in, and maybe this is just what I think about the human being, and our ability to ration and to reason, that we can ask ourselves questions and assess when our anger has gone towards the bad spectrum, when it's gone to the good spectrum. And one of the things that I want to say in the book is that, we were talking about kind of cause for civility. If you allow other people to lay out or to assess your anger for you, then your anger is always going to be bad. So I kind of provide some tools, some questions for people to ask, so they can figure out for themselves when it has gone down the end of the spectrum. I think one of the important questions, and this is going to answer your question about when it goes wrong, is who are you thinking about with your anger? Right. So I mentioned the example that there's a difference between loitering rage and narcissistic rage. And with narcissistic rage, it kind of has all the similar features that loitering rage has, but it's only focused on your particular group, right? Now, Bell Hooks talks about this as an example in her book, Killing Rage. She talks about kind of elite Black folk who get pulled over by the police. And it's only in that moment that they realize, the police is unjust. But even they're only concerned that the police don't treat them like they treat poor Black folk, right? That's narcissistic, right? And I think, when we think about Black Lives Matter, right? Created to ascribe values to all folk, not just straight Black men. Right. So I think it can go wrong, even though it has like the features that we've talked about. When your focus is only on your particular people or your particular gender or your particular people that you think is most oppressed, and these can go terribly wrong in that particular way. And I caution people to kind of be aware when that happens. And a way that you can transition out of that is just to be reminded again, first of all, that you're not the only individual that suffers harm, but it's just a change of perspective is going to allow that to happen. So I do believe that in our capacity to assess ourselves, and there's questions that I highlight to lay out when it does indeed go wrong and how indeed it can go right. So I just stopped it.
Thank you. Those were really illuminating examples. Dav and Alex, would either of you like to jump in here?
I'll say very quickly. Well, I just want to affirm, like what Aisha said was so on point, dovetails with my past work, my ongoing work. I just want to emphasize the importance of an anger and rage that's rooted in community as opposed to in isolation. I think about, I was grappling a lot when I was writing the book with the Baldwin quote. And I always see the first part of the quote. I rarely see the second part, right? To be a Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a rage almost all the time. I see that part. I don't see the rest of it, right? So that the first problem is how to control that rage so that it won't destroy you. I feel like that part really resonated with when I would have Black people giving space to their feelings about anger over politics. And so many of them would kind of end on the note of, well, since there's really nothing we can do, we just got to kind of police ourselves, going back to the idea of self-policing that Maisha talked about early. And I thought about how, kind of heartbreaking, right, an endpoint that is. And like, well, what is the way in which to not feel as though you have no productive or healthy outlet? I think it's a combination of introspection and reflection, and also understanding that you are not alone in this. When we often see marginalized people kind of taking action that they might not otherwise take, it's when they really appreciate that this thing that makes them angry isn't just a quirk of them, right? But this is an injustice that is systematically affecting other folks in their community, real or imagined. And so understanding that you are part of something bigger than yourself can really be mobilized. And I think about how we can distinguish among many dimensions of anger and rage, like the rage that is felt in community, right? Broadly defined, as opposed to rage that's felt in isolation, and a rage that's felt like only with this particular set of people, right, that I'm going to align with. And we can make that connection, hey, this community feels that too, then we can have something really powerful. There's a recent book in the discipline that talks about the role of out-group empathy in politics, which has been really underexplored. But when people can really put themselves in the position of other people going through harm, they're willing to go to bat for those folks. And not surprisingly, who do they find is most empathetic? People of color, women, LGBT folks that know firsthand what it's like. They're able to say, oh, if there's an account of other people feeling marginalization, I don't need to dismiss that. So I know what it's like to feel it and be dismissed. Let me extend myself. I think that's another, they're not talking about anger within that work, but I think there's a role there, right? For collective communal rage to emerge from that. That isn't just transformative, but I think can also be a vital part in the healing, right? Because we're not just feeling the hurt and anger. I know someone talked about this in the chat. We're feeling the pain and the grief and oftentimes the depression, the isolation, right? And so how do we find ways to not let that ball of feelings destroy us, but translate that so maybe we can work to chip away, ultimately destroy, right? Those systems and sets of relationships that harm us.
I mean, if I may add, and I have a feeling that Alex is going to say this because he's a historian. I mean, as much as our answers may seem abstract at this point, I think those who have come before us really lay out and are exemplars of how to put this stuff in practice. So we've mentioned Sojourner Truth, we've mentioned Ida B. Wells, we mentioned King, we mentioned James Baldwin, but I really want to invite the audience to really dive deep into their work, because I think their work and their life really provides kind of a guide and example of how to do the kind of things that we're talking about.
Alex, I think that was an invitation to hear more from you.
Well, I was thinking about Maisha's comments about Lorde, and in my book, I talk about this encounter that she actually had with James Baldwin, where they were having a lecture. They were invited to a panel in New England, and at some point they had this kind of contested disagreement, and Lorde turned to Baldwin and said, "When you talk about race, are you actually considering Black women, or do you think race can simply be reduced to Black men?" And in that moment, Baldwin was kind of frustrated, but he opened up. He was able to listen to Lorde. And similarly, when Lorde gave her famous speech in 1980, when she basically said that the women's movement needed to account for intersectional oppression and domination, her expectation was that the rage, the frustration would create common ground and space. And part of what I'm trying to kind of articulate through this idea of civic radicalism, I think, is that civility presupposes that we know that the rules are normal, egalitarian, that everything is okay. And so if we just lower the temperature, everything will be just fine. And whereas all these activists historically recognize not only are things not fine, but the only way to realize that they're not fine, Baldwin's message of awakening from our moral slumber is to kind of shake people out of their complacency. And one of the things that rage is so effective at is being able to open up ways of seeing the world in a different light, of seeing reality in a way that you can't avoid it. So when civic radicals go out on the streets, when they engage in boycotts, when they try to engage in lunch counter protests, sit-ins in Greensboro, all of them are trying to make it inescapable for the white moderate or the person who believes that they are simply, progressive and okay with change, to confront those feelings. And I think that rage has this real advantage of pushing, as King says, folks to consider what it is that they care about, what it is that they feel. And in doing that, allows for the continuation of conversation, allows for the explosion of what is civil and normal, and perhaps a reconstruction of the world. Thank
you. Really well said. What I'm hearing from all of you is that, and we've talked about this, right, that rage builds community. It's solidarity and rage is the combination that pushes us forward and creates actual change. And I think that's one of the biggest takeaways for our sort of movement audience, for our partners doing the work on the ground, and also sort of the way in which to avoid defeatism, narcissism, to prevent against the ways in which rage can be destructive when not in community, when not in solidarity with an intersectional lens. And I I really appreciate the way that the three of you sort of really map that out so clearly. Moving sort of in this vein, moving through this line of thinking, how can our contemporary movement leaders harness rage? And who should we be looking to for our audience members, for the folks who are going to get, listen, follow-up emails? Who should we be looking to for models for who is doing this work really well? Who comes to mind when you think about somebody who's deploying rage in a way that is actually creating change and working towards justice?
So I can get started. I think of two directions in response to that question. One is, I feel like the question that you asked to kick us off, right? What makes you feel rage, right? You allowed us to say in our own language, right, whatever area of focus we wanted, what kind of really moves us to have that expression. And I wonder the degree to which I'm doing some work with some community organizations throughout the country, particularly that are working with like justice impacted folks. And when they create space for folks to start the conversation, as opposed to imposing upon them, look at this threat to your well-being and this threat, right? From this political party, this official, like they're aware of those threats, but they're just bombarded by it, as we all are, right? We're so bombarded with all these threats, and there's an intent behind that, right? We talked about the cycle of kind of white grievance that is continuously renewed. I think that's intended to both kind of whip that base into a constant frenzy, but also I think to overwhelm everyone else, and they were just numb to it all. And so I think disrupting that pattern of imposing upon people, this is all you have to be mobilized by, and saying, well, let me give you some space to talk about, right? What moves you, right? What are you thinking? What are you feeling? I think that can create a sense of the kind of communal rage, right? As people link together what it is they're saying and what they're seeing in their observations, and allow some of that agency to manifest, right? Because now I get to define the parameters, right? Or the scope or the moment, the urgency. And when I think about contemporary examples, when I think about, what year was this? Not this time around, but the first time Stacey Abrams ran for governor, and she lost very narrowly to Jack Kemp, who as Secretary of State was in control of the rules of the election and did a lot of vote purging. She, right, in a very broad stage, obviously she was not just on the statewide stage, but on the national stage at that point, in her speech after the results were official, she said, this is not a concession speech. And she, I think to use Maisha's language, really did break the rules, right? Was willing to embrace her anger, right? And I think about the ways in which I feel like that really did signal to Black Georgian voters throughout the state, right? The value of their votes and the real significance that there was concern that their votes were not counted to the extent that they were. And so that's, prior to the 2020 election, maybe it was like 2018, right? She and organizers throughout the state, I think, were very effectively able to engender a sense amongst Black prospective voters, right? Look, they won't keep doing this to us, right? This is our chance, this is opportunity. And the numbers of Black folks being registered and turning out in the 2020 election, as we all know, were significant and game changing. And so I think about the ways in which there was a public Black woman breaking that rule and really signifying, not only am I angry about this for me, I'm not just angry because I'm not going to the state house, right? But I'm angry for us, really displaying that model, right? We see it, as the point has been made, we kind of see it. So that's one kind of immediate instance that comes to my mind where, there's that real possibility of generating the kind of range that really does mobilize people collectively to feel we're valued and our grievance is legitimate and we're gonna act.
In my answer, I want to kind of combine a thought that I didn't really, or we didn't probably elaborate. I didn't elaborate on too much, and Davin had brought it up. But one of the things that he alluded to is that anger and other so-called positive emotions, they're not mutually exclusive. And I would even say, it is the case, or typically is the case, that if you have anger, there's no way that you could have anger without having compassion towards someone who you're angry has been wronged, right? There's no way that you can love Black people and not be, angry that they're being mistreated, right? So all that stuff usually go together. And just in the life of human beings, we don't just experience one emotion. I mean, that's just an inaccurate picture of our psychological lives, right? So they usually go hand in hand, or at least that's my view. So considering that, right, if someone wants to answer the question and say, hey, let me imagine a group or a person who predominantly has this angry emotion, and let me see what they're doing in the world. I think that would just be a very difficult question to answer, given that these emotions usually coexist among each other. And at certain points in political moments, one emotion may be more salient than the others, but they usually coexist among each other. So that makes the identification a little bit more difficult, but I think it makes the answer a little bit more easy to answer. I think if you go into any organization, or any kind of movement that is responding to a kind of wrongdoing, whether that's climate injustice and our apathy towards climate change. If you go to any kind of criminal justice organization, you're going to find people who are working in collaboration with those organizations because they are angry about something, but they also feel compassion, they also feel love. And so, one of the things that I kind of end the Break Racial Rules chapter with is I get us to imagine or reimagine what a resistor looks like. And I simply suggest that these are everyday people, not just the charismatic leaders. And so my answer to your question is that people who are doing this stuff right, who's using anger in the ways in which we should model, are probably not the popular folk, are probably not the charismatic kind of largely funded organizations. But if we go into our communities, people who are consistently doing this work that is challenging the status quo, there we will find anger in collaboration with a whole bunch of emotions. And we'll find great exemplars are people who are still fighting despite the anger, despite the setbacks. And to me, they are models of what this kind of anger can do in a political context.
Thank you. I think you both touched on this here, sort of, and this is a recurring theme with at least political research associates webinars. What do we do? Deep canvassing, conversations with people on the ground, those low and slow conversations where we invite, what are you angry about? We build community sort of one person at a time. And I think this is this conversation on rage really fits into sort of this prescription that keeps coming up and is clearly the way forward, although it is hard and slow work. Alex, what comes to mind here for you?
Again, in the kind of theme of thinking about history and what lessons we can learn from history, I think it's so important to actually look at the movements that succeeded. And there are through lines. I think that is, an important thing to take away. I often talk to my students, and many of them feel hopeless about racial injustice and confronting it. And yet we have this incredibly rich history of activists who both theorized racial inequality and found ways to creatively struggle against it. And so, I think the things that come to mind first is the importance of direct action, which we've all been talking about. That is really, rage on some level is about putting yourself out there, making yourself vulnerable, but in making yourself vulnerable, also making an assertion about yourself. And in many ways, all of the acts of nonviolent disobedience that have inspired kind of movements for racial justice are acts that are rooted in this kind of dual motion. So I think, the idea of direct action that really centers on issues relating to power, economic power. We talked about elites. We talked about the reason why, the system will respond once the stakes are raised. And those stakes can be raised in many ways. They can be raised through a call for a beloved community. They can be raised through critique on the street, through protest, but it's important to kind of touch on institutions of power. And I think, the other lesson that we get from history is that despite the calls that the only way to succeed is to narrow the movement, the only way to succeed is to focus only on narrow sets of identity, what we see time and time again is that the movements that succeed are the movements that are intersectional, the movements that are coalitional and try to build solidarity. What's crucial is that all these movements, and this is partly connected to, the image of civic radicalism, they're not trying to reach across the aisle to those who will never understand. The white supremacists, the racists, the misogynists. They're trying to build communities and networks of love, pride, hope within the willing. Those who are willing to get involved, but maybe are not there yet. And I think the whole discourse around change can be really aided by looking at history and how every major anti-racist movement was much more interested in building strength from within so that it can make a claim about justice outside rather than being preoccupied with what the opposition might think, rather than being preoccupied with what critics might think. And I think that that's such an important lesson. And it's so valuable for when we talk about this question of rage. It's important to redefine it. We're talking about rage here for justice. And this is a consistent theme that we see throughout the history of anti-racist activism.
Thank you. I think this was a perfect conclusion to a really good conversation. You all did a fabulous job making a compelling case for rage, a compelling case for problematizing the role of emotions in politics and who gets to use them and who doesn't. And if Stacey Abrams and the disenfranchised voters of Georgia flipping the state blue isn't a compelling case for rage, I don't know what is. And so, I really appreciate it. And also the ways that you talk about this is not just movement leaders doing this work, right? It's all of us in community harnessing our rage and staying focused and motivated because of it. Y'all, this was amazing. This is a really great conversation. I would love to spend another hour with you. I think our audience members might want to continue with their days. But I invite you to stay engaged with the Religion Dispatches and Political Research Associates. We really enjoyed having you on today. And I just want to say the most sincere thank you for spending your Thursday afternoon with us.